This is Cold Start.
When I wanted to learn how to race a car or just drive on track, I'm sort of a nerd, so I decided to look for a school. And there's different kinds of schools. You can go to the SCCA weekend school and try to get your license, or there's more formalized education that you can get to learn how to drive a car, or at least that's what I thought. I looked around and there weren't actually all that many options. Everybody's heard about Skip Barber or some kind of racing school that maybe that's the one in their neighborhood or their local or the one that they think is available. But turns out there's not that many of them around anymore.
Yeah, it's actually really fitting that we're having this conversation today here at Sonoma Raceway. There's one of those exotic experiences that are on track. And I think it's an interesting conversation to talk about kind of what happened to racing schools. It seemed like back in like the 90s and the early 2000s, I mean, even all the way back into the 50s, they were really prevalent. If you wanted to go race cars, there was a process that you had to go through to get certified before you could go onto a racetrack or go racing. And nowadays, there's a lot of people on track. Don't get me wrong. People are going to racetracks. Maybe most of them are uneducated or not as educated as they should be. And maybe it's because these racing schools have kind of died off a little bit.
There's something to be said for learning by doing and making mistakes and getting reinforcement from fixing those mistakes and getting better at a thing organically and gradually over time. But we all need instructors. We all need somebody to coach us, to guide us, to give us some information, at least insight into the things that we don't yet know. Somebody else already had all those hard-won lessons that they can share with you to help maybe accelerate or help you shortcut your process for getting up to speed and learning something. And so racing, driving a car on track, there's so many dynamics and things to consider. It's really a multidisciplinary activity, and it seems like it would benefit from having there be a way by which you can learn the proper way of doing this, the safe way of doing this, the fast way of doing this. That's why we do it. We want to go out and be fast and go race and be competitive. But without any guidance from the outside world, all we can do is just sort of show up and make mistakes and try to muscle through until we're good enough to actually be doing the thing. And God, it feels like there's got to be a better way than this. So to your point, back in the 50s, they started creating these racing schools. I think the first ones were the Jim Russell schools, and they existed in various locations to give people basic education on how to drive a car at speed, car handling dynamics, wheel-to-wheel racing, competitive racing, all of the aspects of things that we would want somebody who was going to be driving next to us in a race car to be knowing coming into the activity in the first place.
Yeah, and you would think with racing, being on a racetrack, motorsports, wheel-to-wheel, all that sort of stuff, any difficult activity I think all of us are pretty used to, the individuals that do it have to be certified. To get certified, you have to go to a school, you have to go through a test, something like that. So it makes sense. Now, back in the 1950s, also, think about where motorsport was at during that era. They're finally coming to sanctioning bodies. They have rules. There's more rules now. There's maybe more safety rules of like flaggers, all that sort of stuff that are coming into play. So now they're like, okay, we're getting more organized in this sport, motorsports. Now let's continue to educate the next generation that's getting involved in that sport. And so, yeah, like basically the pros or the individuals that were just really good at doing that activity, racing cars at that time, started to open up their own schools. And that's why a lot of the racing schools that we hear about nowadays are just a person's name, Jim Russell. It was a real individual. It was a guy. He existed, and he was really good at racing. And so he started his own academy to then teach the next generation. And the Jim Russell Racing School, there was a lot of graduates that went on to go race in high-end series and be very successful individuals. So this wasn't like, oh, just training the general public. No, this was training the next generation of great racers.
It would be a matter of giving them the right tools and the right knowledge so that they potentially could be successful with this activity. And coming into this, we all know that there's potential risk for injury or damage. So having everybody on the same page about what's the right way to go about approaching this activity so that you can minimize the risk and the potential for damage. We all want that coming into this thing. So it was cool. There was sort of like a common way by which people could get licensed and educated, learning the intricacies of a race car, of a race tire, of a race track, of the nature of the dynamics of cars working together in a shared space. And that was a really great resource. And I think people saw that, and it helped to grow this grassroots, newish motorsports arena for everybody so that there was more access for people to go and participate in racing because there were now on-ramps for new people to gain insight and experience in a way that allowed them to participate along the other people who have managed to find their way into a race car and have been doing it.
Yeah, and back then, like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm kind of generalizing, but back then, the people that got into racing, into motorsports and driving cars, did it for a sport. They were athletes. They were going to go do it competitively. Now, there may have been enthusiasts around that time, but for the most part, people that went off and did that activity, it wasn't as popularized as it is nowadays. They went to go be competitive, to go race wheel to wheel.
Yeah, it wasn't just like a leisure time activity the way we think of golf, right? People do that just to like while away time. This was a full sport, people getting into this thing to compete.
Exactly. And then now as we start making a transition to like the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, racing schools are still really prevalent, but there's more individuals that are starting to get into motorsport and maybe not as like hardcore as those individuals back then, but racing was still this activity that you didn't have full access to if you didn't go through the proper channels. Getting on racetracks, driving on racetracks back then, you had to be certified. You had to have a racing license. It's not like nowadays, and I don't think a lot of people recognize that. There weren't just track days that if you had a driver's license, you could bring your street car and go out onto racetracks. There was a lot more restrictions back then, and that it forced people to have to go through racing schools, to have to get trained, to have to get into race cars. And also race cars back then were simpler, but that's a different discussion. But I think that was a different culture in general. And even going into that 2000s era, it was still like that. There was a major shift that happened, I think, maybe in the later 2000s and into the 2010s that kind of changed the whole environment around racing schools, around being able to have access to racetracks and driving on track in just street cars.
A few things changed, right? The activities people were spending their time on and had enjoyment in had changed over time, right? There were no video games back in the 50s and 60s that could occupy people who maybe wanted to drive a car but didn't have quite the wherewithal to do so, whereas in the 80s and 90s and beyond, you could just pick up your video game console and make like you're a racer, and you don't actually need the experience and the vicarious thrills of being in the car and facing G-force. And then over time, what also happened was new racers, what we should say, young people coming up, weren't being sort of ushered into the type of activities that people who came up doing racing were doing. There were places that you could go race, but there were a lot of other activities that have been sort of spun up and presented mostly to younger people, extracurricular activities, community service, things that you needed to be doing because the rigors that were being placed on you as an adolescent were higher with what you needed to do to try to get into a school or build skills that you needed for a potential career. And I think that started to push out people's hobbies and free time in a way that even kids coming up just weren't given the opportunity to go out and try those kinds of things. So the pipeline, if you will, the grassroots new feed of the farm system bringing us more potential new drivers started to dry up. And there was that feeling for a while like, where are all the kids interested in cars these days? Like that existed for a long time, and there was a natural demand for new drivers who wanted to get onto a racetrack. And I think it was around that beginning of the 2000s time where that really started to go away. And we weren't seeing new racing schools popping up. We certainly weren't seeing new instances of racing schools at more racetracks. Back in the day when Jim Russell started, he sort of franchised the model. There was so much demand for the thing that he created, he was able to put his name on these schools that then were placed at multiple racetracks around Europe and the United States that allowed this activity to flourish for new people to get access, to learn the skills that they needed to get on board. And as that became less attractive to people sort of naturally out of the gate, or there were other activities or venues through which they could get similar types of experiences, it meant a smaller pool of candidates to go to these racing schools, and they started having financial troubles as a result.
I don't think it was necessarily like there was a lack of interest for people to jump into motorsports in general. I think in that later 2000s era, I think the barrier of entry started to lower. I think people saw that like there was an interest in people coming out and driving on tracks and being involved in motorsports. And there was kind of like a cash grab, like there always is when people see that people have an interest in something. And they try to figure out a way of like, how can I lower the requirements to open this up to more people? And like the invention of just doing track days where it's like, okay, we're not racing, we're not using race cars, we don't need competition licenses. That in itself is kind of the death of the racing school, because it's like, okay, why am I going to spend $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 for a 3 to 5 day racing school to get licensed to then go wheel to wheel racing, which is its own cost, when I can just go pay Joe Schmo down the street that's running a track day organization a couple $100 and I can bring my own car.
Yeah, and especially for somebody who's not that familiar with what it takes to do this, they feel like, I can go 5, 6, 8 times for cheaper than one of those schools for fewer days, and I'll have more experience on track.
Right, and I can learn myself, and it's like this whole thing of people no longer valuing like, oh, learning an activity correctly, to then like, no, I just want to go and do it, and I'll learn myself, and I know better, and people just thinking that like they can figure it out on their own. And so like, and once again, this transition occurred of racetracks basically allowing this to happen. Now, not only are they renting their track to only racing schools that can only operate so much because the demand is only so much for it, and running actual sanctioned races, now for those racing facilities as a business to be able to open up and sell their days to track day providers that then can just bring in anyone. They're like, yeah, we don't need any more competition license. Like anyone from off the street can come. Like we'll tell our insurance people, whatever. I'm speculating, but like this is a valid business model of like, if I'm a racetrack and now it's like the later 2000s, whatever the case is, early 2010s, and I'm seeing all these track day providers starting to pop up, or this idea of that, I'm like, yeah, I can make a lot more money doing that. Like there's more individuals that are willing to spend a couple $100 to come drive their car for a couple days rather than individuals that want to spend thousands to get into competition driving. And so I think that opened up the market, which kind of ruined racing schools. And yeah, racing schools have always kind of had this hard time, I guess, in recent that we've seen, right? That they have a hard time staying open. I think like the Jim Russell, Skip Barbers, and Bob Bondurants back in the day were highly successful for a long period of time and were around for decades, because there was this restriction of like, no, you have to go to a legitimate school with legitimate teachers and get licensed if you want to go to racetracks. And as soon as it was like, no, you can have a driver's license and come to a track day, I think those ones started to struggle. And it's like, it seems like they always like changed hands pretty often.
Yeah, there was this brand naming. There was a cult of personality that went along with these people who know how to drive so well they're going to open a school to teach other people. That's, to your point, they're all named after the guys, who did these things, Jim Russell and Bob Bondurant. And they had their own flavor, whether they were more formula car oriented or GT or sports car oriented. The schools were a little different, but ultimately was about teaching that set of skills. And of course, over time, what has happened? The cost of entry into this space has increased as well. As much as there's now all these new avenues for people to, grab a Miata or something inexpensive to participate, racing is still expensive. And now there's this new avenue called track day that you can show up for. And wouldn't you know it, everybody involved from the track itself, right? We just talked about private racetracks and that trend. Racetracks are trying to capitalize their asset more and more, because the racetrack sitting empty for any period of time is like lost potential revenue. And if you have a racing school at your racetrack, there's a lot of downtime. Like people aren't driving all day long. And so the racetrack sees that and says, boy, it feels like we could be getting more bang for our buck here. We can be selling these track days to providers who are going to use it all day long and maximize the economic benefit to us for having done so. In fact, we used to host having a racing school at this racetrack as a way to get people to come to the racetrack in the first place. They were going to come to a race and see what it looked like, and we wanted them to be excited enough to come and think that maybe they can participate in this activity too, and they could go out on track and drive. And in order to do that, you needed an on-ramp. And a lot of the time, those on-ramps were offered at the racetrack itself. If you came to Sonoma Raceway, if you came to Sears Point Raceway, there was a building that was a racing school. And you could go there and ask for information about how you could learn to start participating in this activity. And what happened over time is the cost of having a fixed presence at the racetrack also became a lot higher, as did the cost of operating a fleet of vehicles and operating a team of coaches. So what happened was the facility part of this, that was the expense, having a building, having a bunch of cars, having a bunch of people all in one place. went to more of this distributed franchise model where now there'd be the name of a school and they'd have their set of assets and they'd take it on the road. So they were no longer resident at the Sonoma raceways of the world, but rather they were a mobile program and they would go from racetrack to racetrack and offer to whomever signed up for that program in advance an opportunity to do a race school at that racetrack for the period of time that they happen to be there. So there's this shift away from it being a persistent, permanent fixture at the racetrack to being something that just shows up once in a while, kind of like the extreme or exotic experience that's going on here today. It's not teaching people how to race or how to drive a car properly. It's giving them an experience. It's a thrill ride. This is a theme park experience. It's not an educational one. It's not a training one.
Yeah, I'm sure like they're giving them the basics, but it's not for like educational purposes like you're talking about. It's to ensure safety and that they don't wad up these really expensive cars. Like I'm sure there's instructors telling them what to do, but it's not like, a dedicated ground school of like, here's all the things you need to know, like going deep into it, which like I think about like how I got a competition license and I started racing. I didn't go to a racing school. It wasn't the normal way. Like when I got my competition license, it was in the middle of the 2010s and I went through NASA. That was the way that I got my competition license. And now that I'm thinking about this, like if I compared it to like, well, why did NASA exist as an organization? Well, they didn't like what SCCA was doing because it was a bunch of old people doing it the old school way. And so like going back to my point, I'd finally have evidence of like this shift that occurred. Like back in the day, if you wanted to get a competition license and go racing, usually people were like, yeah, you go get an SCCA competition license. And they still exist nowadays, but SCCA was strictly just racing groups. You had to go to their school, get the license, get a race car, then you could go and do the racing events with SCCA, the organization. Then NASA, the way that NASA was founded, which people kind of know about it in the grassroots club racing realm across the country in the United States, the way that NASA was founded was they wanted to be more groundbreaking, innovative, more youthful, free-thinking comparative to SCCA. And so NASA as an organization had HPDE, high-performance driving experiences, which was strictly street cars, not race cars, as well as doing the club racing and licensing, which was an interesting thing. So when I got my competition license, back to that story, the way that you do it through NASA is you can go through their HPDE ranks 1 through 4, beginner to expert, and that's all in a street car. Mm-hmm. And once you graduate Group 4 and you want to go into either time trials or their wheel-to-wheel racing, they have a licensing program where an instructor will ride with you on track. So there's an on-track portion as well as a written portion. So they actually give you a test. So that goes over all the stuff of like racing procedures, flags, all that sort of stuff. Now, once you do that, they give you a NASA provisional license, and then you can go and race in that wheel-to-wheel groups with NASA. Once you complete 4 races, you get signed off as long as you did everything correctly, you didn't hit anyone, you didn't go off, all that good stuff. They'll sign it off, and then now you have a full competition license. So now, rather than just dumping a bunch of money into one weekend of a racing school, they allow you to just go through their ranks and get a competition license. So it's kind of like, I can see the transition that occurred there of like this movement away from like, yes, very strict, you need to do this, this, and this to be able to get on track, of like, no, we're going to open it up and we're going to be a little more free-flowing of who we allow to get into this.
Yeah, it seems like it went from a strict personality-driven, one person's opinion about this is the way it must be done, to one where we had this association, right? This group of people doing the thing together that formed a club. And now the club overall was going to sort of guide those activities so that people were getting up to speed and educated in such a way that was compatible with sort of the ethos and approach of that club. And I think we started to see that approach take apart a little bit the individual racing schools as a model, because now there was more access. They seemed like they were more available to me. NASA operates in multiple regions around the United States.
Right.
SCCA has their regions. So the idea of this sort of fanning out and getting closer to the grassroots of where people are going to do their racing seemed like a really good trend. But I guess in a way it came sort of at the expense of the private racing schools, or rather they were competing with those private racing schools because they were largely cheaper, more economically efficient for you to go and do the club model versus a private school. You could largely use your own equipment in the NASA model if you're doing HPDE versus specialized racing schools that have only their kind of car and you need to use their equipment no matter what. And eventually I think this yielded a further, I'll call it a watering down in a way, of education about doing track days, which was a lot of enthusiast clubs, not racing clubs, mind you, but manufacturer-affiliated enthusiast club, Audi Club, Porsche Club, BMW Club, etc., began offering their own experiences and offerings at which they would have instructors provide, let's call it very elementary level education about how to drive a car on track. The benefit to them was they were selling more cars. This was usually affiliated through the manufacturer or a dealer, and they're going to show out there and wave the BMW flag at people who are excited about having their new BMW. And look, we're teaching you how to use it at the racetrack. And if you follow our program, maybe someday you could be an instructor with the BMW club, and we'll help offset the cost of some of your track days because you're doing us a favor by helping to teach other people. But what that did was it sort of took the requirements of and knowledge of what that expert who was going to be the teacher of the racing school was, right? The Jim Russell, the Bob Bondurant, is now sort of watered down through a club full of people, a manufacturer-affiliated set of people who now do this thing for fun, and to get it for free, they're going to say, sure, I'm willing to teach some people or spend some of my time to educate others. The level of rigor and expertise that any of those coaches has is so much different than what the full racing school program and instructors were able to offer, that now I feel like that's also had a negative effect on the racing schools and the sort of body of people who are getting education, in air quotes, around racing.
Yeah, I think it's just like a decrease in demand for the people that actually want to go through the proper channel to get educated, because the bar's just no longer that high. I mean, like, back when it was just SCCA, the bar was like you had to go to a competition school to get on track. Now NASA's introduced across the country. Now it's like, oh, you could just sign up for HPDE. So if you don't want to spend all of the time, resources, money to go wheel-to-wheel racing, which you had to if you wanted to go onto a racetrack, that was your only option. Now it's like, oh, I can just bring my own car and just spend money, and I can just do HPDE. So I don't have to go all the way down the competition route if I want to drive on racetracks. Now it's even watered down further, like you're talking about, where now it's just experiences. Now the barrier of entry is I don't even need to have a performance car to go do HPDE. I can just give BMW, Mercedes, Hyundai, whoever else it is, money and just drive their cars on track. Whatever this exotic experience is, I just give them money and I get to drive a supercar, Lamborghini, Ferrari, McLaren, whatever it is, on track. And so it's like the barrier of entry to drive on racetracks has been lowered and lowered and lowered over the years. And I think that's what's killed the racing schools. It's like no one is required now to go through the extra steps of fully being educated to be able to go and do the thing. So, I mean, like, you can compare it to any other activity. It's like, think about if like pilots, like think about if flying planes became more accessible and easier and easier and easier. It's like, well, in the beginning, like that activity should be highly regulated. You have to be certified. You have to go to flight school. You have to learn all these sorts of things. But then think about if the barrier of entry of like buying a plane was a lot easier. And it's like, oh, if you just buy a plane and pay for fuel, you can just go up into the skies. It's like, whoa, hang on. Whoa, now, like, we want to make sure that this is still a controlled environment. I think, like, to an extent, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole of talking about how, like, you know, people that can get on racetracks nowadays, you see maybe an increase in crashes and mistakes and all this sort of stuff happening because people are no longer required to get licensed to be able to operate at these facilities. The barrier of entry is just so low. It's just kind of a free-for-all.
People are sort of nibbling around the edges at this activity instead of sinking their teeth fully into it, right?
Yeah.
I think that was the requirement. If you wanted to aspire to do this thing, you got to take a big bite. You got to go and get the education and put in the time, and then you'll have the opportunity to do it. And I think there's a parallel here out in the working world, like in the career world. It used to be that, of course, you had to go to college in order to go out and get a good job. And, certainly there's there's plenty of valuable vocations and technical fields that we need people doing and all of that. And this isn't not to minimize those in any way. But there was a point to general education at a higher level that we said was worthwhile, such that we wanted the majority of people to go and do that. And over time, we realized there were certain professions or careers where maybe you didn't need the full rigor of what the colleges were trying to teach you in those areas. Certainly tech is one of those fields where we've seen, a bunch of people go and get their math or computer science degrees, be the emblem of what's the right path in order to have a career like this. And then we heard about, CEOs who dropped out from still prominent big schools, but dropped out from those, or didn't even go to college at all and became successful and made a lot of money. So we said, they don't need that education. Look, obviously you can be successful without it. And while that's the case, we sort of are losing something. In the same way that, to your point about the pilots, I was thinking about this. If somehow you could get access to learn how to do surgery on humans, and that became a more available thing to the point where, like, it's just not that hard. Like, are you going to go to a doctor who doesn't have a medical degree from a university? Because, they figured it out. It can't be that hard. They got access to the tools or the insight somehow to know how to, like, carve up your body and probably not kill you in doing it. Don't you want them to have some level of regulation, requirement, rigor, knowledge, something, some barrier to entry that they had to go through in order to be participating with these people in the same space? Well, it's not that way in racing a car, but you are heavily reliant on all of the people around you and those sort of adjudicating and setting the rules and the structure in place, because they're the ones that are going to determine whether or not that's a safe activity or whether everybody gets to go home at the end of the day.
I was going to say, yeah, like, I guess racing's not that serious. Like, comparative to like heart surgery or flying planes or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, racing nowadays, everyone just sees it as like a bunch of people just having fun on a racetrack.
Driving
right?
in circles.
Exactly. And it's like, I guess it's more like looking at the bigger picture of like racing back in the day used to be so much more serious, and like people took it a little bit more to heart and like tried harder and wanted to be like really good at it, where nowadays it's just like, yeah, go have fun and mess around. And ultimately, like, honestly, I would blame this lowering of the standard, right? I think that's what's happening here is like the standard of requirement of what needs to be able to get out onto the track. I would blame that on the racetracks themselves. I don't think you can blame the track day providers, because it's like, yeah, if I'm not being forced by the racetrack, by the facility of like, hey, if you want to come here and you want to participate and drive on our track, you need to have this, this, and this. If the racetrack's not going to tell me that as a track day provider, I'm not going to do it, right? I'm going to operate my business to make the most amount of money as possible. And I really think that like the whole mindset or the motivation or the incentive by the racetracks not to maintain or now increase their requirements of what drivers need to be able to operate or come to a track is money, right? Like if they increase their standards, if they increase the requirements necessary to drive on racetracks, they lose out on a huge market nowadays, which is track days. And so like, I think really honestly, the choices of racetracks, that has been the true death of racing schools, because it's opened up the doors to track days. And honestly, if I'm looking to get into racing or looking into getting into driving on track as a consumer, yeah, I'm going to go to a track day. Like that's way cheaper than like having to go down the huge rabbit hole. But the thing is like, okay, racing schools are dying. They're kind of disappearing, kind of still exist. They're out there. They're not really what they used to be for the most part, but there still are organizations that will help you get licensed. So like those people that do want to go club racing, there still needs to be channels. For club racing, at least, you still need a competition license. Awesome. Great. Really good. I like that, to know that everyone's kind of on the same page. Even in racing, complete tangent. But even in racing nowadays, like if you want to race wheel to wheel, there now are organizations that have popped up that you don't need a full competition license. Like Lemons.
Right.
You don't need a competition license.
Lucky Dog.
I think Lucky Dog's the same way, that you can just have a driver's license. So like the bar is just continuing to be lowered, and it's like no one's forced to go to Lemons or Lucky Dog. So it's kind of like, yeah, you just have to be smart about like who you choose to go race with. But like, it's just one of those things of, it's kind of the fact of motorsports nowadays. But let's change the conversation. I think like, I feel like I'm getting a little ranty on this side of the microphone. So let's get into the conversation of like kind of the flight path of these schools. Some of them are disappearing. A lot of them get rebranded. But like in today's environment, are there still schools available for those individuals that might be listening? They're like, hey, yeah, okay, maybe I've been doing track days for a long period of time. maybe I should take it a little bit more seriously to properly educate myself of how to drive a car. And even if I don't want to go wheel-to-wheel racing, like at least learn from the professionals. Are there some that are still available?
Yeah, or maybe you're just not that self-driven where you want to, figure out your own course for how to learn this thing. You'd rather just go take a concentrated period of time and immerse and use that as your sort of stepping stone into this space. The reality is the economics of operating in this environment are really tricky. And I think the point you made earlier about the racetrack operators is essential. A lot of these racing schools used to be affiliated with or had some kind of arrangements with racetracks because it was expensive for the schools to rent racetracks independent of having a presence. It was expensive for the racetracks to lose revenue on days when maybe they would operate a school day and there's other things that they could be doing to utilize their asset. And you have in between there racetracks looking for more ways to monetize their space and to bring in new customers into that space well beyond the sort of feeder system like we used to have of young people coming up who wanted to learn how to race a car. So it's really hard for the racing schools who now are operating without those facilities, moving from place to place, transporting large numbers of cars and personnel, having to set up shop at a new place every time they operate, and having to pay rent at the rate of a daily rental rate versus a package deal or volume discount that maybe a school could work out with a racetrack if they were going to take 30, 50, 80 days in a year. So the economic realities of being a racing school today are probably more difficult than they've ever been before. And yet the requirements for what you need to provide are higher. The expectations of safety and standards for what a race car that we're going to throw you into to teach you and need to be are just very different than when it was Bob Bondurant down in Arizona just throwing people in stock cars and sending them out on their merry way. The expectations for what the provider will do for you and how they will treat you along the way has changed too. I think this went from a trial by fire type of a thing where you just hoped you could stick with it and be good enough to continue to be allowed to do it versus them trying to find ways to make it easier so that people don't bail out or aren't afraid to try because the standard and level of sort of grit of the people going to these schools has changed over time too. And people aren't willing to work as hard or try as hard or try and fail and have to come back and really learn from a point of reinforcing skills. Rather, it's being offered as this experience where people want to come away feeling good from it. And maybe the level and difficulty of the training being provided is watered down as a result of that too.
Yeah, so looking at some of those that have survived the test of time or even are still operational nowadays, because Jim Russell used to be here at Sonoma Raceway, and that was kind of their U.S. operations because Jim Russell started over in the U.K. and they had some other racing schools over in Europe. But here in the States, it was actually here in our own backyard here at Sonoma Raceway. Now, that school ran until about 2006, 2008. Hey, look at that. It's following our timeline of when racing schools started to have a hard time in the late 2000s.
Yeah.
Now it got rebranded and it turned into Sim Raceway, which both of us, you more so than I, are familiar with Sim Raceway and its operations here at the school. But then Sim Raceway at one point was no longer a thing. So in 2019, or I think it was 2018, Sim Raceway was no longer a thing. And the school kind of around Sonoma Raceway kind of dissolved for the most part. But there are other schools that still exist in this area. So kind of talking about a handful of those ones for those individuals that are looking to go and get certified or get a competition license or stuff like that. There is Allenberg down at Laguna Seca. It's a school that exists. They specialized in formula cars. Bob Bondurant, which used to be a very prominent school, that's been rebranded and is now the Radford Driving School, which you can get a competition license through them, through their racing school. There's also the Lucas Oil Racing School that exists, and they're kind of like the old school Jim Russell style. The cars that they use are open wheel cars with no downforce. Remember those old Jim Russell cars that
like
they
the
used
Formula
to use?
V or whatever kind
Exactly, yeah, and they almost had like 18-inch wheels. Like it looked kind of funky and like off proportionate.
Yeah.
So Lucas Oil, they kind of have a similar vibe where they use very kind of rudimentary race cars, which is great. Like that's what you should learn on, is not this overly complex or overly complicated machine. So the Lucas Oil Racing School, they do some stuff. I think they're mainly kind of around like the southern region or Florida for the most part, because And then Radford, that's a permanent location. Same thing as Allenberg. They don't travel. Skip Barber was the one that kind of traveled around from track to track. So who knows what their plans are for 2026.
And there's more specialized training. I went through a drag racing school program through an individual private instructor, and there are several of those. Frank Hawley was a really well-known drag racing instructor who created this sort of school model. And then in other forms of motorsport, we're mostly talking about wheel-to-wheel, GT car, tin tops, formula cars, but you get into sprint cars, drag racing, other formats of racing, and there are other venues that exist for where to go do this. It might look a little different, it might feel a little different, but they do exist in other areas.
Yeah, I think that's what's kind of interesting is like road course racing, when we typically think about like racetracks, Sonoma Raceway, Laguna Seca, VIR, all that sort of stuff around the country, like the generic racing, the generic getting on a racetrack, that's what's been overly popularized, and that's where like track days really exist.
Right.
Where now where we get back into this whole like specialized areas of motorsports, whether that's rally, circle track. I mean, I don't even know like the requirements to get into circle track racing. That'd be a great deep dive to figure out. It's like if I want to go run like Friday night under the lights in like a pro stock or whatever the simple circle track cars, it's like, do I need a license? Do I need to go to a school? I don't know. But like, think about getting into like a sprint car. Do you think like you can just walk up and get into a sprint car? I mean, maybe. I don't know. But like some of those more specialized stuff, like there still are schools to like get into that. They're maybe experiential, but also like very much educational still, like Dirtfish that you mentioned up in the Pacific Northwest, the Ventura School for sprint cars and midget racing.
Yeah, Bridgestone operates that ice and snow driving facility in Colorado.
Yeah, which that's an awesome experience. So like more of the specialized and stuff in motorsports where it's like you couldn't on the weekend take your own street car and like go and do this stuff, whether it's rallies, snow driving, circle track driving, stuff like that. Like in those areas, there still are schools, which is awesome. So like it takes a little bit more of a deep dive because back in the day, racing schools used to be like an easy like search of like Skip Barber or whatever else. Like it was more prominent. Nowadays, you just have to do a little bit more sleuthing and avoid the ads on Google to find like the real racing schools.
Yeah, there's not an index of these or any one place you can go that's the central authority, right? That's one of the issues. There were a few that we recognized as the authorities, as the major name brands, the same way we do with auto manufacturers, plainly. And yet what's happened in this sort of push toward getting more people into cars with lower requirements, the manufacturers are even offering their own track days and HPDE-like experiences where you can go out in your maybe newly purchased whatever brand car, Hyundai, and Hyundai puts on a program where you can come out and tear around the track in theirs. And in a way that's sort of scratching an itch that wasn't able to be scratched previously, that caused people to have to go and seek out other ways of getting that experience. You know, if it wasn't so easy just to show up in Vegas and drive a supercar around the track a few times and, you know, pay a couple $100 for it, you'd be looking for other ways to achieve that same kind of experience closer to you or in a way that was accessible. And the nature of the experience market, if you will, I think has really watered down what it means to be racing, because now people are perfectly satisfied to have the racing-like experience and walk away from it and feel like they did it, to the point where I've had conversations with people at track days in person talking about driving our cars on track, and I asked somebody about their experience and they said that they've done this thing all day long, and then you ask them again about it and they're like, oh yeah, on the sim. And they've actually confused in their mind the skills that they developed, the experience that they've gained, let's say driving on a slick tire, in a simulator, but they've never done it in reality to the point where now they're convinced, well, you know, I did it in the sim, so it's fine. And there are things that translate, but not all things do.
Yeah, I think you're getting into like this overarching conversation, which I totally agree with, which is like the experience generation, where we're no longer interested in actually learning the skill in depth and becoming a master at something. We'd rather just go around and experience a little bit of everything, where it's like, I don't want to get into motorsports and be dedicated over years and master this skill. Just sign me up for like the BMW M experience and like let me floor a car and drive on track, and I'll call that good enough. And I think the biggest thing here is to really recognize of like, yes, the experience market, it should exist, right? Like I think it has a place, but it's important for people to recognize that like you're not really learning anything when you go to one of those experiences. Like if you go do the Richard Petty experience and drive around in a circle, like those are so dumbed down cars, and that's an amusement park ride. Like that's not a real racing school. You're not learning anything. They're just making sure that you're safe and that you've enjoyed being in a car that kind of looks like a real cup car and drive around a big circle, but just don't get it mixed with the real thing. And like, just because you go and do one of these experiences, AMG Academy, BMW M Track Days, whatever it is, and you're like good, or you feel like you can keep up with the instructor, you don't have the necessary skills to be like an excellent driver on track. Like it would still be worthwhile to go to a real school and learn and understand wheel to wheel and all that sort of stuff. And I've seen way too many self-anointed experts at track days that think that they have it all figured out and they know exactly how they need to drive on track and what are the do's and don'ts. And they have zero experience, and they have zero experience going to a school and properly learning how racing actually should be on track. And so I think that's the important thing, is that like, I would encourage anyone, wherever you're at, if you're in the experience side, the track day side, or in the early stages of getting into racing, is just keeping that open mind. Don't feel like you know everything, especially if you haven't gone through those like proper educational channels. And remember, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a higher, very much higher bar that was required to get on track. So keep that in mind. Just because you get to drive your car on track doesn't make you a race driver.
The experience is something that's, I think, really interesting and pervading culture in ways that's affecting way more than just motorsport.
Oh, 100%.
Right? This is a matter of giving people the sensation that they've had a facsimile of some activity, experience, lifestyle. They've ticked the box. Generally sufficiently done in a way that you can just show the pictures to somebody else, right? Photos or it didn't happen. That's what we say. And that's the reality of what these experiences has become. They haven't been dig your fingernails into this thing that's hard to get a hold of to start and do the work necessary and spend time, and it's not glamorous and it's not sexy, and there won't be a lot of good pictures to show people for a while. But if you do all of that, you can get to a level where you can achieve success in club racing, in amateur racing, even in professional motorsports, if you stay with that. But people don't generally have the follow-through, the attention span, the interest to see this through to the extent that they can do the glossary level of it, just scrape the surface. I sat in the car. I got around the track a few times. Sure, I wasn't racing against anybody, and my lap time didn't mean anything, and I had somebody telling me what to do the whole time. But hey, look, cool. I have a video of me driving at 100 miles an hour. Isn't that amazing? Not really, because a lot of other people can get exactly that same thing the same way you did. And the point of having built a set of skills and developed capability and the things that does to a human aren't there in the experience space, in that lifestyle play space. It's sort of faking it. It's sort of just touching it to say that you did it. And we all know, and those of us have spent the time to try to get up to speed and learn the sort of harder way, we kind of feel like there's things that you're lacking that you just aren't going to get through the path that you're following that is going to make your achievement or contributions in some way deficient compared to the people who've gone through this whole experience of learning and being educated and spending time. And maybe it's just a different mindset for what racing is or driving on track is as an activity. Instead of the end goal being you did it, the end goal in the old days maybe was you did it and accomplished something or achieved something or got from A to B. And I think the expectations, the standards now are just more of like, you did it, and that was enough to satisfy the having done it.
Yeah, and it's like, I'm trying to think of like, are there opportunities in the future? And like, if I was to go out there, and what would I change about this whole culture? And it's like, if I ran a track day organization, I would think to myself of like, all right, maybe I would take my drivers' meetings more seriously, or try to like add more of an educational element, or like, try to teach people something. And I think the unfortunate reality is like, yes, that's possible. You can go out and do that, but I don't think that it would be successful. Like if you're known as the track day where it's like you have to sit in a classroom for an hour before you get to go on track, I don't think people are going to sign up for your day comparative to the competition. Like when I went and did my track day not too long ago at Thunder Hill, like the driver's meeting was all online and like you just had to take a quiz. So like you just showed up at the track and you got to go on track. Like, and for me, I like that. I was like, cool, awesome. We get straight to the point of like why we came here. And so I think it's hard to change the culture and change people's mindsets of like, no, we need to like learn, and you should be interested in learning and wanting to know more and how can I get better and all that sort of stuff. And I just think that the whole model in and of itself has kind of changed, unfortunately, at the demise of racing schools. I think that there's been a larger surgence of maybe private instructors, one-on-one instructing, like where people that actually are interested in that, yes, it might be more per day than going to a racing school because it's one-on-one coaching, tutoring. But I think for the people that want it, there are those individuals, those experts, those ex-racers that are available to be able to do that sort of stuff. And I wish it was more available for the masses, but it seems like the pattern has been that the masses don't care to be educated and they just want the experience and go home and be like, I got to drive my car fast and post a video and photo onto Instagram.
It's, I think, all these things, right? People's own expectations for what they need to do to feel accomplishment are different, and the economics of the situation are different. What it costs to operate a racing school, what it costs to attend a racing school, not a lot of people can just come up with $5,000 for a fun thing to do. They have other expenses. They can't necessarily make that happen all at once. So it is cool, and it is democratizing by having these other avenues for people to gain access so that they can enter this area. But I think what we're losing is that sense that when you have to work hard to get somewhere, you know how much more accomplished you feel. When you put together that piece of furniture yourself and you looked at it and it was straight, you're like, I feel good, versus just having bought it and it showed up that way, right? Like that never happens. But there's something we're losing there. And in a way, I want to blame the racetrack operators for losing sight of the fact that their future, their responsibility in creating this sort of facility is in helping to foster that next generation of upcoming grassroots enthusiasts. And of course, it's not actually the responsibility of a racetrack operator to help new people come into the field. Their responsibility, as far as they're concerned, is just to figure out how to make money off the thing. But both can exist, even though the economics of racing schools are a little challenging today. If racetracks themselves would invest in the facilities, the capital outlay, the required staff in order to put these things on, it's perfectly compatible with the other activities they have happening. They just need to figure out a way for those to be as lucrative as selling private memberships to the racetrack to people who just want to host parties trackside with their friends, or have that lifestyle play of the garage full of cars and just be near the racetrack. I think there's a difference there. And I don't know what's going to force that hand. We just did an entire episode about private racetracks and how that's a trend that we're seeing in full force that doesn't seem to be letting up at all. And if that's the case, how many of those private racetracks are going to offer racing schools open to the public? Zero. They might have racing schools. There are private facilities where you can go and participate in the school program. Over at Spring Mountain, there's the Radical Racing Academy. The manufacturer, GM, have Cadillac and Corvette programs they put on at Spring Mountain. You might say those are probably more accessible to the average person, if you want to call them that, than the thermal club model as we defined in our private racetracks discussion. So those do still exist, but there's some middle ground of how do we have those racetracks like Sonoma Raceway used to be, that were a hub. They were a magnet. They were a place that you knew that if you wanted to go learn how to race, you show up at Sonoma Raceway and you go to their school there, the same way they had at Magny Cours or at Silverstone or whatever other places around the world that had these fixtures of these racing schools that were based there. It created the draw such that people went to those racetracks in order to gain experience and get the education in racing because they were there. And so it helped those racetracks get a reputation for being the place where people learn how to drive. And wasn't it amazing when you'd watch that NASCAR race, that IndyCar race, that professional level motorsports race, where you hear people talking about, and they started out their career, they were an instructor at Skip Barber, or they were an instructor with Jim Russell, or they were a participant. Their parents drove them early in the morning when they were a little kid to come and do the racing school and start karting or whatever it was. And that's changing. And we need to acknowledge that. It's not something we have to accept, but it's a problem that needs to be solved for this model of how people learn how to drive, for it not to go away. And I'm not entirely sure, other than bearing upon the racetrack operators to care about this and invest in it, for this to be something that can continue to exist.
Yeah, and I think that's like the final note that I want to make, or the final point that you brought up there, which is these schools used to also be platforms for young talent to get into professional racing. Like the Jim Russell Academy, there was the Jim Russell Series championship. And if you won that championship within the school environment, they would give you a check, a scholarship to then go race professionally. And it gave people that had talent an opportunity to actually get into racing. And without these racing schools, without those series, I mean, it really doesn't exist anymore. Like finding any sort of program that offers a scholarship to whoever can win that championship is kind of few and far between. And it makes it a lot more challenging for those younger talents that may not come from, well-off backgrounds and well-off families to make it to the big leagues. And back then, those schools gave them that opportunity. And so it completely, without these schools, it completely changes the whole ecosystem of how people can get into race cars that maybe can't afford it. And I think we've seen that for a little over a decade now of most people that can get into race cars, you have to have the money to do it. And the schools back then used to be that avenue of you didn't have to have money.
Yeah, and there's, to some extent, sim racing is starting to fill that gap. I've started to see a lot more of these sort of prize award or giving people the opportunity to get into a real race car coming out of the simulator environment. But while there have been success stories there, it's not replacing the racing school as the training ground. They learn a certain set of skills on the simulator, but not racecraft in the same way that they're going to learn in the physical world. They might learn how to execute a pass relative to the thing that they see on their screen next to them, and that could translate into driving on the racetrack. But there's so much of that is really operated as a marketing exercise. It's good for, Fanatec to put out a dollar amount cash award for people to use their online platform for sim racing and to offer them the specter of getting in a real car. It doesn't cost them all that much. It's not being taken seriously enough to the point where this is now how the next generation of people are learning how to drive, because there are still gaps in what sim racing teaches to the skills that you need to get in a physical car. So I think while there may appear to be incentive type programs like those scholarships that were out there, they're not directed the same way. They're certainly, I'll say, operated with a bit more of a cynical point of view, or for marketing or pure profit reasons, right? The reason that there is a scholarship that Fanatec will pay you money if you win the sim racing series is because that allows them to promote getting more people onto their platform who give them money. They're not actually doing this to be seen as the training ground for the next, ranks of future motorsport superstars. Their goals are monetary. It's not about creating this ecosystem or this population in a way that the racetracks sort of had a connection, because they had to be somewhere. They were physically in a community. There were people that were part of that motorsports ecosystem who showed up to work every day to work as a turn worker or work at the speed shop or, whatever it was. Those racetracks exist in real space. And that's something that the iRacing world doesn't have and can't offer to somebody who might not have the wherewithal to show up at the racetrack and buy a day in a race car, but isn't going to get them into that same level of experience in any comparable way to what the racing school was doing previously.
All right, I'm going to leave you on this final proposition of hearing all of this and the state of motorsports in general with the schools and sim racing and everything. Why isn't there an iRacing racing school in the real world?
It would make so much sense.
You could race in the sim and earn credits or whatever that you could then go to the real school in the real world and learn how to drive real cars. I'm just saying, might be a good idea and a great solution to this whole problem.
Roger Penske, if you're listening, buy iRacing and put it at Indy.
The iRacing Racing School.
At Indy.
Could be a better name, but we'll see.
The iRacing Indianapolis Racing, no. It doesn't have to be there. It just takes somebody with vision and the resources to be able to do something like this. And maybe it's not iRacing, right? Maybe there's some other platform out there or whatever it is. But it does need to be, if the goal is to drive an in the real world car, you're going to need to get that experience somewhere. And simulation is great, but I'll say it's necessary but not sufficient.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful. I really enjoyed my experience going through a racing school. I felt really fortunate to be able to do it. I was glad that I could find one that was still operating. It was a fantastic experience. I'm really sad that they don't exist anymore. Story for another day about the Sim Raceway story. But there's an opportunity there that I just wish other people could have. And I don't know, I'm a little bit of a loss for how to offer it to people. Maybe it's a worthwhile discussion to keep having for what does the racing school look like, into the 21st century, where the dynamics are what they are, racetracks are what they are, people get experiences and they feel like that's sufficient. Is this something to chase after? Maybe it's not. Maybe we're just sort of old heads about racing and we just like the way it used to be and that was the right way to do it as far as we're concerned. But people coming up now, they might say, that's just the old way. I didn't go to college.
The track day killed the racing school star, and we'll leave it at that. All right, this has been a fun conversation. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Silas.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.